Hello Boibles and Gurgles. I didn't get to finish the questions in the workshop for consumers and firms and markets this week, week 4. So this video is just to go through that. First question is this. Our setup is the following. The Chinese government puts a cap on the retail price of coal so that its relatively poor population, both households and small businesses, can purchase relatively cheap electricity produced by coal-fired power stations. What is the immediate disequilibrium outcome of the price control? So here's the diagram that you've been given. A price ceiling has been imposed, a price cap. You can't go above the ceiling, but we can see the ceiling, that price ceiling imposed by the government is below the equilibrium price. In that case, we can see, given the demand and supply curves, that the quantity that would be supplied by private suppliers would be below the equilibrium, and the quantity demanded by consumers would be above the equilibrium. So we have a shortage of 2.5 million tonnes per week. It's pretty straightforward. We should bear in mind that this model that we're using here, the perfectly competitive model, is probably a poor model to use, because it's highly unlikely that the coal market in China is a perfectly competitive one. So although there may be very many buyers, it's not entirely clear that there would be similarly very many sellers. Okay. Furthermore, it's also not clear, and is unlikely, that the coal being produced is being produced entirely privately. It's entirely possible that the coal being produced in China is actually produced under the direction of the government itself, and so it's not likely to be true that in fact the quantity supplied would necessarily fall. The government could simply direct coal suppliers to maintain a higher level of supply at the disequilibrium price, the price ceiling. Nonetheless, we're going to use this model anyway, because it gives us some kind of vague idea about problems that could conceivably arise. Assuming the price control is strictly enforced, what will be the sizes roughly of the buyer surplus, the seller surpluses, and the deadweight loss in dollars? Back to our diagram. Obviously the quantity that's supplied at the price ceiling is 97.5, so no more than that can be purchased. The deadweight loss we can see immediately. It's going to be the economic welfare area that is no longer being generated because the market is not producing up to the equilibrium level anymore. 99 million tonnes is no longer being produced and consumed. So that part of economic welfare has been lost. That's the deadweight loss. We can easily calculate that. We can draw a rectangle that encompasses the triangle and then divide it by 2. So it's going to be $125. That's this length here, $125, multiplied by the width here, which is 1.5 million, and then divide that by 2 to get $93.75 million per week in lost economic welfare. The producer surplus will be the area under the newly set price up to the quantity bought and sold, and above the supply curve reflecting the marginal cost of production. You calculate the area of that triangle. So again, you find the length 50 multiplied by the width, which in this case is 97.5 million, and then divided by 2 to get 2.5 billion per week. What about the consumer surplus? Well, the consumer surplus is going to be the area under the demand curve up to the quantity bought and sold and above the ceiling price. So this area here. So we can divide it up into two parts. C is going to be 75 multiplied by 97.5 cut in half. So that's 3.66 billion, and C star is simply the length times the breadth. So 125 times 97.5 is 12.19 billion. And there you go. Add them together, you get $15.85 billion per week in consumer surplus. If the government carefully monitors the quantity of coal being sold but does not pay close attention to black market activity with respect to the price, what is likely to happen to the real or the secret market price? And what is likely to happen to the buyer and seller surpluses? Well, in this case, if the government's paying close attention to the quantity being produced but pays no mind to the price, it's entirely possible that you will find the sellers of coal secretly increasing the price to the maximum price consumers are willing to pay for that output. In that case, we would see that the price will no longer be at 550, but will be pushed up to the highest price consumers are willing to pay for the 97.5, which is here. So this price is around about, what's that, $675 roughly. So that means the consumer surplus will be squished into this little green triangle here. So the producer surplus will now be P plus C star. That is, the producers will have been able to appropriate, or gobble up, that C star area which would previously have been consumer surplus. Okay, now we'll go on to part 2. And here we're dealing with questions about smartphones. Again, this is likely to be an inaccurate model. So we're using the demand-supply model, which assumes a perfectly competitive market. And we know that in the case of smartphones, the suppliers of smartphones, the manufacturers, there's not very many of them in the market. There's a few dominant players. So the model is arguably not appropriate, or it's not the best model you could use. There are superior models to that. But we're going to use it as a kind of back-of-the-envelope approach. It's a first approximation, a poor first approximation, but an approximation nonetheless. I'll just let you watch what happens on the screen. I won't make any commentary from here on in.